The Bible says God created Adam as the first human being, formed from dust, breathed into life, the beginning of everything. Then it says the earth he was placed on was already dark, ruined, and without form. This seems impossible. If Adam was the beginning, why does the very first chapter of Genesis describe a world that looks exactly like the aftermath of a catastrophe? Why does the earth already exist in Genesis 1 to 2, covered in darkness, submerged in water, formless and void before God even says, "Let there be light"? This single contradiction has been used for centuries to argue that Genesis cannot be trusted, that the Bible is internally inconsistent, that the creation account is myth, not history. But the answer is not a conflict between science and Scripture. It is not a gap invented by theologians desperate to reconcile the Bible with geology. It is hidden in two overlooked Hebrew words sitting quietly in Genesis 1 to 2, waiting for someone to stop and ask what they actually mean. Two words that reveal a world that existed before Eden, before Adam, before the garden and the serpent and the tree. A world the Bible never fully describes, but never fully erases either. And when you understand what those two words mean, everything changes. Not just how you read Genesis, how you understand why the world is broken, why darkness existed before light, why the earth needed to be remade rather than simply made for the first time. Have you ever truly paused to consider the silence between Genesis 1 to 1 and Genesis 1 to 2? Not the words, the silence between them. A gap so vast it could contain entire ages of history, entire civilizations, an entire cosmic catastrophe that Scripture records the aftermath of, but never fully explains. Imagine standing at the edge of a ruined city, broken walls, flooded streets, total darkness, no sound, no life, just the wind moving over the water. That is what Genesis 1 to 2 describes. Not a blank canvas, ruins. The question is, what stood there before it fell? Leave us 777 inches the comments if you are ready to go where almost no Sunday school class has ever gone. Because the history that was supposedly erased has been hiding in plain sight in the first two verses of the Bible all along. Let us begin at the beginning, the actual beginning, not the version that has been simplified for convenience. Genesis 1 to 1 says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." Genesis 1 to 2 says, "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters." These two verses are read as a continuous sequence. God creates, and what He creates is, at first, formless and void. Then He begins to shape it. Light, sky, land, plants, stars, creatures, humanity. The familiar seven-day structure. But there is a problem with this reading, and the problem is in the Hebrew. The word translated was in Genesis 1 to 2 is the Hebrew verb haya. This verb is almost always translated as became in the rest of the Old Testament when it describes a change of state. When Lot's wife became a pillar of salt, that is haya. When the staff became a serpent, that is haya. The verb describes transformation, not initial condition. So why is it translated was in Genesis 1 to 2 rather than became? If the translation followed the standard pattern, the verse would read, "And the earth became without form and void." Not the earth was formless from the moment of creation. The earth became formless. It was changed into this condition from something else. This is the gap theory in its most linguistically precise form, not a gap invented to make the Bible fit geology, though it does that too. A gap demanded by the Hebrew grammar itself. Between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, something happened. The creation that God made in verse 1 was reduced to the formless, void, dark condition described in verse 2. And what happened in the 6 days that follow is not creation from nothing, but recreation from ruins. This interpretation is not a modern invention. It was held by early church fathers. It was developed into a full theological framework by the Scottish theologian Thomas Chalmers in the early 19th century, and later popularized by C.I. Scofield in his reference Bible, which sold millions of copies and shaped the theology of the evangelical world for generations. It was taught by G.H. Pember in his 1876 work, Earth's Earliest Ages, one of the most careful and comprehensive treatments of the pre-Adamic world ever written. These were not fringe figures. They were serious biblical scholars wrestling seriously with what the text actually says. And what the text says, if you follow the grammar, is that the world of Genesis 1-2 is a world after a catastrophe, a world that was once something and became ruins. And if it was once something, then there was something before Adam, something before the garden, something the Bible does not tell us about in detail but preserves the evidence of in 2 words: tohu wa-bohu, formless and void, the fingerprint of a world that was destroyed. Now the question that immediately arises is, if there was a world before Adam, what was in it? What lived there? Who or what inhabited the earth before God recreated it for humanity? Here the Bible becomes deliberately silent. But the surrounding biblical context, the internal logic of the text, and the tradition of theological reflection that has wrestled with these questions across centuries gives us more to work with than most people realize. The first clue comes from the fall of Satan. Ezekiel 28 contains one of the most extraordinary passages in the entire Old Testament. It is addressed ostensibly to the king of Tyre, a human ruler. But partway through the oracle, the description becomes impossible to apply to any human being. The figure being described was in Eden, the garden of God. He was an anointed guardian cherub. He was on the holy mountain of God. He walked among the fiery stones. He was blameless in his ways from the day he was created until wickedness was found in him. Until wickedness was found in him. This is not a human king. No human king was in Eden as an anointed guardian cherub walking among the fiery stones. This is a description of a pre-fall supernatural being of the highest order, a being of extraordinary beauty, wisdom, and position who fell through pride. Isaiah 14 amplifies this with the famous passage about the one who said in his heart, "I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of assembly on the heights of Zaphon. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High." 5 I wills, 5 declarations of intent to usurp the position of God. But before the fall, this being existed. He had a position, he had a role, he had a dwelling. He was in Eden, on the holy mountain, among the fiery stones. He was the anointed guardian cherub, the most exalted position available to a created being. And here is the question that the gap theory raises in its most pointed form. When was this being in Eden? Which Eden? Because in the Genesis narrative, the Garden of Eden is created for humanity in what we would call the Adamic creation. Adam and Eve are placed there after the recreation of Genesis 1. The serpent they encounter there is this same fallen being in one of his manifestations. But Ezekiel says he was in Eden before his fall, before he became the serpent, before he became the adversary, when he was still the anointed guardian cherub, blameless in his ways. If the Adamic creation is the recreation after the gap, then the Eden of Ezekiel 28 may be the Eden of the original creation, the world before the world, the creation of Genesis 1-1 before it became the tohu wa-bohu of Genesis 1-2. The fall of Satan, in this framework, is what happened in the gap. The guardian cherub of the original creation exalted himself. He was cast down. The judgment was cosmic. It reduced the original creation to ruins. And then God recreated the world for a new kind of being, one made from the dust of the ground, one formed differently from angels, one that bore the divine image in a particular way that the cherub had refused to honor. This is the framework, and it has implications that most people have never been told about. But let us go further, because the question the title of this video poses is specifically about humans before Adam, not angels, not supernatural beings, humans. Is there any biblical evidence for human or human-like beings existing before the Adamic creation? This is where the territory becomes genuinely contested and genuinely fascinating, because there are several passages in the Bible that, read carefully, suggest a pre-Adamic context that is difficult to explain within the standard reading. The first is the Cain question, which we have explored in another video, but let us look at it again here because it is directly relevant. When Cain is driven out after murdering Abel, he says, "Whoever finds me will kill me," and God places a mark on him to protect him from being killed by others. Who are these others? If Adam and Eve had only Cain, Abel, and unnamed daughters at this point, who are the dangerous others who might kill Cain? And where does he go? He goes to the land of Nod, east of Eden, and there he builds a city. Cities are not built by one person. They are built by populations. The standard answer is that Adam and Eve's other children, daughters primarily, had multiplied enough by this point to constitute a population. This is possible, but it requires a compression of the timeline that the text does not explicitly support. And it does not explain the specific geographic designation, the land of Nod, as if Nod is a known place with a known population that Cain is going to, not a place he is going to settle alone. The second passage is in Genesis 6, which we have also explored elsewhere, but which carries additional weight in the pre-Adamic context. The sons of God see the daughters of men and take them as wives. The Nephilim appear. These are described as the mighty men of old, the men of renown. The implication of the phrase men of old is that this was already an ancient tradition at the time of writing. It points backward to something that preceded the current narrative. The third and perhaps most intriguing passage is Deuteronomy 2, which mentions several pre-Israelite peoples who were known as Rephaim, Zamzummim, and Emim. These were described as tall and mighty, as great and numerous as the Anakim. And the text says something remarkable about one of them. Before them, a people great and many, and tall as the Anakim lived there. But the Lord destroyed them, and they dispossessed them and settled in their place. The Lord destroyed them. A people great and many and tall as the Anakim, already in the land before the peoples, that the Bible traces through the table of nations in Genesis 10. Who were these people? Where do they fit in the genealogical structure of Genesis? The text does not say, It simply acknowledges their prior existence and their divine destruction. These passages do not prove a pre-Adamic human civilization, but they do suggest that the world the Bible describes has a deeper history than the surface reading of Genesis provides. There are peoples and beings and destructions that the text references without fully explaining. The gap theory, as a framework for understanding this deeper history, has a significant problem that must be honestly acknowledged. It is the same problem that all gap theories face. The text simply does not tell us directly. It is an inference from grammar, from the meaning of tohu wa-bohu, from the fall of Satan narrative, from the various anomalies in the early chapters of Genesis. It is not a statement, and the inference can be contested. The most common objection is that the verb haya in Genesis 1-2 can be translated as was rather than became, and that the formless and void condition of the earth is simply the initial state of creation before God begins to shape it. This is the position of most modern biblical scholars and most major commentaries. But this position has its own problems. It does not adequately explain why Jeremiah uses tohu wa-bohu to describe the aftermath of a judgment rather than the beginning of a creation. It does not adequately explain why darkness is a condition that needs to be addressed by divine light rather than simply a neutral starting point. And it does not engage with the Ezekiel 28 evidence for a pre-fall angelic existence in a form of Eden that preceded the Adamic Eden. The honest position is this: the text preserves evidence of something before Adam. It does not spell out what that something was. And different interpretive traditions have filled that silence in different ways. The gap theory is one filling. Young Earth creationism without a gap is another. The day-age theory is another. None of them is without problems. None of them is explicitly stated by the text. What the text does do is leave enough ambiguity that anyone who claims the question is settled and obvious has not read carefully enough. There is a tradition within Jewish mysticism, specifically within the Kabbalistic tradition, but also in earlier rabbinic sources that speaks explicitly of worlds before this world. The Midrash Rabbah on Genesis contains a passage that has troubled and fascinated Jewish scholars for centuries. God created worlds and destroyed them before he created this world and said, "This one pleases me. The others did not please me." Worlds, plural. Created and destroyed. Before this one, this is not a peripheral tradition. It appears in the most central collection of rabbinic commentary on Genesis, and it is consistent with the framework we have been developing. The existence of prior creation events, prior worlds, prior beings, this idea is not alien to the Jewish interpretive tradition. It is built into it. The question is what those prior worlds contained, and here the tradition is deliberately vague. Some commentators understand the prior worlds as entirely spiritual, as arrangements of divine attributes or aspects of creation that were incomplete. Others understand them more literally, as physical worlds with physical inhabitants that were destroyed. The Zohar, the central text of Jewish mysticism, goes further. It speaks of pre-Adamic kings who reigned and died, the 7 kings of Edom, mentioned in Genesis 36, who reigned before any king reigned over Israel. These kings are interpreted in Kabbalistic tradition as representing a prior cosmic order, a prior arrangement of divine energy that collapsed before the current world was established. The death of these kings is the destruction of the prior creation, and the current world is built from their remnants. This is not simple mythology. It is a sophisticated theological and cosmological framework for understanding the structure of reality across multiple creative epochs. And it preserves, in the language of mysticism, the same insight that the gap theory preserves in the language of biblical grammar. The world we live in is not the first. Something came before, and what came before was destroyed. Now we need to face the question that this entire framework forces into the open. If there was a world before Adam, if there were beings before humanity, if the creation of Genesis 1-1 was destroyed to produce the tohu wa-bohu of Genesis 1-2, why? The fall of Satan is the most theologically developed answer available. The guardian cherub, the highest of created beings, chose to exalt himself above God. He gathered followers. He attempted to usurp the divine throne. The judgment was catastrophic and cosmic. The original creation was reduced to darkness and ruin, and from those ruins God recreated the world for humanity. But this raises another question. If God knew the guardian cherub would fall, why create him with the capacity for that fall? Why create any being with the freedom to rebel? This is the oldest question in theology, and the answer, in every serious theological tradition that has wrestled with it, is the same. Freedom is necessary for love. A being that cannot choose cannot love. God did not create puppets. He created free agents, and freedom, by definition, includes the freedom to choose wrongly. The fall of Satan was not a surprise to God. It was a tragedy within a story that God knew would ultimately resolve into something greater than the original. Paul, writing in Romans 8, says the creation was subjected to futility not willingly but because of him who subjected it, in hope. The futility is real, the subjection is real, but it is in hope. The story is not finished at the tohu wa-bohu. It is not finished at the fall of humanity. It is moving toward a resolution that will exceed everything that was lost. The pre-Adamic world, whatever it contained, was not the final word. The Adamic world, broken as it is not the final word. The new creation, described in Revelation 21 as a new heaven and a new earth where the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, is the final word. This is not the first creation. It is not the second. It is the third. And in the third there will be no more tohu wa-bohu, no more darkness over the deep, no more morning star fallen from heaven, no more guardian cherub turned adversary. The God who began in Genesis 1-1 will finish in Revelation 21, and what he finishes will be better than what he started. The scientific dimension of this question cannot be entirely avoided, even in a theological discussion. Because one of the reasons the gap theory has attracted so many serious scholars is that it provides a framework for reconciling the biblical account with the geological and cosmological evidence for an ancient universe. If Genesis 1-1 describes an original creation that could be billions of years old, and if Genesis 1-2 through 2:25 describes a recreation event that occurred more recently, then the apparent conflict between biblical chronology and scientific chronology is resolved without compromising either. The universe is old, the Adamic creation is young. Both can be true simultaneously. This is not the primary reason to take the gap theory seriously. The primary reason is the biblical grammar and the theological coherence, but it is a significant secondary consideration, and it explains why the theory has attracted scientists and theologians simultaneously, why it appeared in the margins of Bibles read by millions, and why it has never entirely disappeared from serious theological discussion, despite the opposition it has faced from both young earth creationists and from mainstream biblical scholars. The evidence for an ancient earth is not going away. The evidence for a young Adamic creation, if one accepts the genealogical structure of Genesis at face value, is also not going away. The gap between them is real. The gap theory says that the gap in the Bible corresponds to the gap in the timeline. This is at minimum worth taking seriously. There is one more dimension of the pre-Adamic question that almost never gets addressed in theological discussion. It is the most personal dimension, and it is the one that makes this question matter not just academically but spiritually. If there was a world before Adam, if there were beings before us, if the creation we inhabit is a recreation from ruins, then what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be made in the image of God in a world that has already been broken once before it was given to us? The answer that the biblical framework provides is both sobering and magnificent. We are not the first, but we are the intended. Adam was not created as a replacement for whatever came before. He was created as something new, something different. The image bearer, the one who would rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and every living thing, the one to whom God gave dominion, the one made just a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned with glory and honor, as Psalm 8 puts it. The world was recreated for us. From whatever ruins preceded us, God made a garden. He planted it. He filled it with beauty and abundance. He walked in it in the cool of the evening. He made it a place of intimacy between himself and the human beings he had formed from its dust. And when we fell, as the beings before us had fallen, he did not destroy us and start again. He entered. He became one of us. He took on the dust from which we came. He carried the consequences of our failure in his own body. He rose, and he promised to make all things new. The new creation of Revelation 21 is not a return to the original Genesis 1-to-1 creation. It is better than that. It is not even a return to the Adamic Garden of Eden, though the imagery of the garden appears in the New Jerusalem. It is something greater, a city, a community, God dwelling with his people not in a garden that can be lost, but in a city that is eternal. First the garden, then the ruins, then the garden again, then the city. This is the ark, and it suggests that each stage of creation, including the pre-Adamic stage we cannot fully see, was not wasted. It was part of a progression. Each fall, each destruction, each recreation was moving the story towards something that could not have been reached without passing through the darkness. Even the tohu wa-bohu was necessary. Even the void and the darkness were part of the path to the light that never goes out. What should we do with all of this? We should hold it with appropriate humility. The gap theory is a serious and defensible interpretation. It is not a certain one. The text is genuinely ambiguous in places, and that ambiguity should make us careful about building too much on inferences from grammar and silence. But we should also hold it with genuine curiosity. The Bible is a deeper book than most of us have been taught. Its first 2 verses contain layers of meaning that generations of scholars have not exhausted. The question of what existed before Adam is not a foolish question. It is a question the text itself invites by preserving the evidence of something that came before without explaining it. We should let the question deepen our understanding of who God is, a God who creates and recreates, a God who brings order from chaos not once but again and again, a God who does not abandon the ruins he finds but transforms them into something new, a God who faced the fallen guardian cherub and did not simply start over but began the longer, slower, more costly work of a redemption that would take all of history to complete. And we should let it deepen our understanding of who we are, not the first beings to inhabit this earth, but the ones for whom this earth was remade, the image bearers, the ones in whom God planted the breath of life with a directness that the text does not record him using with any other creature, the ones he loved enough to become. The pre-Adamic world, whatever it was, is gone. The new creation, whatever it will be, is coming. And between those two bookends, we live in a world made from ruins, moving toward glory. That is not a small thing to carry. It is, in fact, everything. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Does the gap theory change how you read Genesis? Does it change how you understand what we are? Subscribe, because we are only beginning to go where most Bible teaching refuses to go. The text is deeper than anyone told you, and we are going to keep going deeper together. Until next time,